He was completely beloved. So again, this is like a kind of person that doesn't fit neatly into the categories of the cancelable categories, I suppose. He was completely beloved, but like a wild animal in a cage at work. Like that's not someone who even should have been in an office at the end.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum. Quick note before we get started. You've heard me talk about it before, but I'll remind you again, the Unspeakeasy is doing a co-ed retreat in Chicago, June 4th and 5th. It's not an overnight. Sorry, just daytime only, but it's going to be great. And our guest speakers have been announced. They include Nadine Strawson, prominent free speech advocate, former president of the ACLU before the ACLU went insane. Nadine will be joining us. We will also be joined by Eric Smith, who is a professor of rhetorics. He is one of the co-founders and he's the president of Free Black Thought. He's been on this podcast a couple of times. And Lisa Selin Davis, the author of many books, and she writes a lot about gender, and you've heard her on this show as well. So if you want to get in on that, go to theunspeakeasy.com, check out our retreats, go to Chicago, and apply. You do have to apply because I need to make sure you're not insane. So everybody has a good time, which they always do. Okay, my guest is author Sloane Crosley. Sloane is a much adored and much celebrated writer. She's probably best known for her humorous but existentially probing personal essays. Her collections, I Was Told There'd Be Cake, and How Did You Get This Number, were bestsellers. She's also the author of 2 novels. She has a new book out, her 6th book, and it's a memoir. It's called Grief is for People, and it covers a year in her life following the death of a very close friend, as well as a burglary that occurred in her apartment. It also, without coming out and saying as much, is a book about grieving the end of a certain era in the culture business, in the book publishing business specifically, and even office culture more broadly. Sloane worked as a book publicist for many years at Random House before becoming an author herself. And we talk here about what it was like to work in those offices back then. We also explore the phenomenon of collective grief over animals that become symbols of something much larger. For instance, the response to the death a few months ago of Flaco, the Eurasian owl that got out of a zoo enclosure and flew around Upper Manhattan for more than a year, captivating not only the New Yorkers who saw him in real life, but people all over the world who was following him on social media. What is that about exactly? Certainly upset me. As always, paying subscribers will hear the whole conversation. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, go to meghandom.substack.com and join our listener community. And here's my conversation with Sloane Crosley. Sloane Crosley, welcome to The Unspeakable.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
We're here to talk about your new book. It's called Grief is for People. It's your 6th book. It's a grief memoir, which is a genre now, I guess, but it has this very sharp, kind of angular quality. I don't really know how else to describe it, that makes it really different from a lot of grief memoirs I've read. And I want to talk about why that may be. But we should say that the person who died is your best friend, Russell, who'd been your work colleague, your boss, actually, initially, and then your dear friend. He died by suicide in July of 2019. And in June of 2019, you had your apartment broken into and all your jewelry stolen.
It was a great time.
Good times. The book like toggles between these 2 events in a really interesting way and weaves them together. And this was now almost 5 years ago that this happened. So my first question is, when did you get the idea to write about Russell's death using this framing? Because I imagine it wasn't the first thing that came to mind when you thought about potentially writing about this as a book.
No, that's very accurate. I mean, I guess I'll go backwards and say that it's funny, you said angular and you were stressing it in a way just now where I thought Oh, that's funny. It does sound a lot like angry, which.
Oh no, I'm just thinking of the square. Maybe I'm just thinking of the shape of the jewelry. There's something very
how funny. Yeah,
like sharp and like diamond
You're like,
cut
it's a
about
reflective book, would you say?
Yes.
What are the prongs? No, I think that, no, but I was just thinking about, like, I do think they're actually interchangeable in my mind. I know what you mean by angular, and I think it's a bit of an angry book in some ways, which we can kind of get back to. But no, I didn't always have this in mind. I mean, in a way, it's just chronological. I hate to disappoint people who are sort of looking for like the origin of the structure, but it's really a year. It's from June 27th, 2019 to sort of mid-pandemic 2020. But it's not marketed that way because I think you and I both, and probably many listeners, lived through the trend of, the year of fill in the blank. My year of this, my year of not eating dairy, my year of just only eating salt, or, I mean, not to say anything about like AJ Jacobs, my year of living biblically, I always really liked. But anyway, so it's that. But what happened was, part of the chronology of it is the jewelry happened. And the way I tend to write essays is, sometimes I'll be sort of noodling with a theme, and then the facts of the case or an event or story will be the bullet point. But oftentimes it's the reverse, where I have something happen, and to keep it or to protect it from just being complaints or, whiny or sort of navel gazing, I usually wait for something to bolster it that's bigger than the story. And even at the stage of a felony, it wasn't big enough, And then a month later, Russell, who had actually been trying to help me a little bit sleuth or piece together who might have taken the jewelry, where it might be, he died 3 nights after we had dinner. And I don't know. I mean, I guess the crassest way to say this is careful what you wish for, because instead of the jewelry being supported by other themes, it became a more minor bullet point that was intertwined with this time period where I lost my dear friend.
Can you talk about your relationship with Russell? He's not your boyfriend. You say you are not one another's person. Right. So he's a gay man, but you say he's not your person. You're not his person, but he was incredibly important to you nonetheless, and vice versa.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is since not since he died, the following term was in place before then, but the phrase like work wife or work husband, which I always find as like borderline cloying, as like push present. You've never, oh Lord. Okay. Well, it's something that certain, I'm assuming this is an incredibly heterosexual situation and cisgendered situation where like a man will give his wife a push present after she gives birth.
Oh, yes. Like a push, a push ring.
It? Oh, is it the rings now? I just thought could be like a necklace or like a set of playing cards. Which seems,
so this is when she has a baby. Sorry, I thought you were talking. I thought push present was some sort of corporate jargon, like forward facing. Sorry, public facing. Sorry,
that
like
actually
you got to push the present.
Sounds very good for what it is.
I like that better than getting a present for giving birth.
For giving, you're
by non-C. If you have a C-section, do you not get one?
You get an airlift present.
You get like
I don't know what you get.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the same present, but it hangs from the ceiling. I don't know what you get.
Okay.
But anyway, so I object to the work wife, work husband term. I think it's at once too exaggerated for most situations, and for Russell and I, it feels like a little reductive. But basically, he hired me at Vintage Books when I was around 25, and I worked for him for about 10 years. And we worked in the publicity department. He ran the publicity department, and it was sort of love at first sight for both of us from a friendship standpoint. I like to think it was more on his part, really. But he was this incredibly generous, literate kind of person where, I think when I got into publishing, I thought, I'm going to make people read again. And then you quite quickly realize how difficult it is to get people who I already identify as readers to buy books. But he actually never lost that. He never lost that. I'm going to make America read this or this. And they're going to know he got like Stoner by John Williams back into print, Haywire by Brooke Hayward. He banged the drum for the Everyman's Library to reissue all these like specific collections of James Baldwin and Stephen Sondheim. And he was really puppyish. Like he liked to play pranks on us in the office. He would tape little ads for like vacation packages to Siberia to my computer monitor. Very cute. He set up a fake email address for my cat, from which I would receive such missives as, Mommy, why didn't you come home last night? Or Mommy, why are you wearing the same outfit 2 days in a row? And I'm like, and then of course the cat she wasn't very responsive. But and so he was great, but he was also a sort of, obviously you can see how that would bleed into sort of either annoyance or inappropriate jokes. He just had a lot of energy. He was like a big dog you need to run out in the yard, except that he was in an office. So sometimes it didn't go so well.
Yeah, it struck me that this is a book that is grieving many things, obviously Russell first and foremost, but also a dying industry and a way of living and working with other people that is just simply no longer available.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't really meant it to do that. Like you're conscious of most of the layers of a book, you're driving the car. So I knew that it was about Russell mostly. I kind of thought it had, these 5 parts that are loosely based on the stages of grief, but would be my plan was for it to be sort of concentric circles. The robbery is very small, and then Russell is bigger. And then you have New York publishing, COVID, the world. Sort of like that old poster of like a New Yorker's view of the world, And then in execution, it turns out it was all Russell. The whole thing was Russell soup to nuts. And so it became so much about that kind of relationship and how it doesn't exist anymore. But if I thought there was an undercurrent to the book while I was writing it, and I still think this, I was like, well, this is a tribute to people who work behind the scenes in the arts. Every once in a while you get a television show or something like this, but this is a tribute to those people.
Before we talk about the sort of sleuth detective story aspect of this with the jewelry, which is like kind of remarkable actually, can you explain a little bit about what a book publicist does?
Well, it's like any kind of publicity where you're trying to get public attention in whatever form the public will still allow it for your product, I suppose, which it's strange to talk about books like widgets like that. But, I would say the same for film or art. So you're pitching, I used to make more phone calls, but it's probably almost all emails or I don't know, Slack channels where you're pitching various outlets to say, please either interview the author, review the author, mention the book in a roundup. And it's sort of this constant negotiation for space. And obviously you're competing with book publicists who are usually in-house, although there are freelance ones who work for, HarperCollins, Random House, Simon & Schuster, and so forth. And, within these publishing houses, there are imprints. I don't know how far back we want to go. Like when a man and a woman love each other very much, they make an imprint, but when we go back, and Knopf is a very venerable imprint within Random House, and it also had still has a very sort of vibrant and longstanding paperback arm, Vintage Books. And Russell ran the publicity department for Vintage, which means that his specific job was a combination of like books that were just in paperback or paperback originals, which to the layperson is more of a straight to DVD thing, where he was trying to get them press, as well as sort of minding the shop of years of, I don't know, name somebody, Gore Vidal, Philip Roth, Toni Morrison. It's really weird that I said Gore Vidal first. That, so he was in charge of like the anniversary editions, let's say, of In Cold Blood and promoting those. So it's also, you do events as well. So when you hear about an author on book tour, there's a book publicist behind that. I don't know if that makes... Is that too much or not enough explanation?
No, and one of the things, because I think this is just the kind of thing a lot of people
they take
would
for
have
granted
no occasion
or they
to
don't
think
know.
about.
Yeah.
But you also would find yourself doing things like escorting an author around town. You talk about being with Alice Munro. So if an author has a big book tour and they come to New York, for instance, and they make the rounds of different bookstores, signing stock, signing the book. So the publicist, someone like you, would really sort of just shepherd them around in the town car and tell them where they're getting out, and you're going to go do your public radio interview here, and then we're going to go there.
It's funny because yes, I did do that, and even that is antiquated. I mean, there's a lot of get yourself into an Uber now, figure it out.
Get yourself on a podcast.
This is why the good Lord made like a tram,
Yes, whose dog is about to bark.
Yeah, but I did. I was Joan Didion's paperback book publicist, so that was just I did escort her, someone like that, or Alice Munro around for physical reasons and also respect reasons. Like there's certain people you don't shove into a cab, or Han Pamuk, Joan Didan,
Wow. Were you escorting her? Sorry, that is the proper term.
It is.
Escort,
it is
by
funny,
the way,
isn't
so
it?
don't get the wrong idea. Were you taking Joan Didan around for your magical thinking?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, but she'd already, the great thing about, by the time you hit a paperback tour as an author and as a book publicist, I mean, the bad thing is that you might be on autopilot, or sick of it. But you also know the answers to most questions. It sort of reduces the number of ums per square inch, I think, in any interview by the time you have it out in paperback. So she was really old hat at, physically people would come up to her and say that, they loved her book. And then they would share their own stories of, their nephew who just died and who had this sort of vicious kind of leukemia. And they would ask her, does it ever get better? And I would just always be sort of flabbergasted. I'm like, this is the person that you want comfort from?
What did she say to people?
Well, she was very
like that?
gracious. She'd say, no, you work around it. That kind of thing. But she was very, one thing I always like the record to show is that she ate a lot.
Really?
Yeah, she ate. I watched her, at very nice meals, but I watched her polish off some like pretty nice sea bass,
Yeah, we should say Joan Didion probably weighed less than 80 pounds.
Yeah, and
I think she said as much.
Well, she weighed less than, I don't know if she weighed, I don't know how much she weighed. Publicists do have, there's a line. We're not medical doctors. But I do feel like part of it was like writing those 2 grief memoirs, and she was already looked sort of stricken physically and had her whole life in a way that I think people assume that like she was sort of wasting away out of grief, in addition to being a tiny, tiny person, in addition to being quite frail. And it just was not my experience.
Wow.
That's I want that. Let this podcast.
Interesting. Okay.
Anyway,
right. Did not mean to get off on the subject of how much Joan Didion ate, but okay.
I did.
So back in the day, to be a book publicist, it was a glamour profession, even if it didn't feel like it a lot of the time. And so you were dealing with books and big personalities, and you really had a mission. I mean, you were marketers, but you also cared deeply about art. And Russell was like, very much a classic of that kind of type.
Absolutely.
In that kind of profession.
Very I think what it is, he's protective over the artists and either who they already were or who he felt they should be in the public eye in a very genuine way. It's not just mailing galleys and sending emails. Like he genuinely felt this sort of duty to them.
Right. And he would do something which, again, I don't know if we would see this today, have everybody from the office like come up to his country house for the weekend, and you guys would just sort of lie around and read manuscripts and in the sun and, drink your cocktails at 4:30 or whatever it was.
Bring me another Mai Tai. No, it was like he sort of recognized that, for as much of a glamour profession as it is, very infamously, glamour professions pay their youngins quite poorly because, you can't really pay your rent. My sister works for Tiffany and has for a long time. And she always makes this joke that especially when you're younger, you get paid in the ability to not have to repeat what you do in a crowded bar. People say, where do you work? You say the name and no one's like, what's that?
Oh, wow.
And I feel like Random House was similar, and I feel like, so he sort of recognized that he could give us, it wasn't a large country house and it was sort of peeling paint, but that he could give us this sort of respite from, 8 roommates and, college loans and all of that and debt and stress and hot subways. And we would go up to his house and now it would not exist because I think people do have company retreats, but they're much more, they're structured. This is just a guy who was like, hey, everybody, who knows how to play hearts, you know?
Yeah.
Who knows how to cook a chicken? Let's come on, you know?
But he also, his husband was there a lot.
Yes,
And I
his
mean,
partner, yeah.
you sort of allude there was some sort of intrigue and there was, enough
Well, his
people up
husband
there.
lived there more than Russell did. So Russell would come into the city on the weekends, and this was the house they shared together. But we would have these late nights because the thing is, when you become a part of this industry, you're not really, it's not one of these things where you're assigned to do it. It's not really a family business kind of thing or a practical kind of thing. You're in it because you genuinely love books or more accurately, some books. Well, there's a thing, there's this sort of forced cheer now, which is, are you a book person? Do you love books? And I'm like, I don't love books. I don't even know what that means, but some of them. And we would talk until like the wee hours and have these debates about, art and literature. I mean, we also gossiped and talked about nothing, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to circle back to that, but let's get to the jewelry theft. This does sound like something out of like a 30s madcap movie or something. But so you left your apartment for an hour. You came back to find that your jewelry cabinet, which was a piece of furniture that Russell had helped you purchase or insisted that you purchase, had been ransacked. Your laptop was still sitting there, remarkably, but your jewelry had been stolen. And not only was this alarming for the obvious reasons, but you had actually written an entire novel about jewel theft. So it was a strange coincidence.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, in the novel, my first novel, there is a character who becomes obsessed with a necklace, and he decides he's going to break into a French chateau and find the necklace. Obviously, it's a little more complicated than that, and yeah, some guy crawled through my bedroom window, left muddy boot prints on my bed, and took all my jewelry. And I'm not someone who, there's not like a Kardashian-esqueness about me. So like what he made off with was, I think, 41 pieces of jewelry, and most of it was what you think it is. It's like beads and plastic and like, like a pair of earrings from like Rachel Comey, that were like acetate or something like that. But also, my grandmother and my great grandmother, anything they had left me. So there were a couple of pieces that had trickled down from my mother, specifically a necklace, which is what was funny, and a ring. And I didn't, as I say in the book, I actually did not know how much they worth because I never had them appraised. So I don't know how anyone else would know. Do you know what I mean? I'm not wearing them out. I'm not. So it's like, the guy sort of lucked out in a way as much as I did not.
I mean, that's so strange. Why do you think he didn't steal your laptop?
Oh, that I know the answer to. Traceable. They have numbers. You can't really steal electronics. It's really hard to resell electronics. I've learned so much now. I have a fence if you want. After writing this book and going through this experience. But yeah, it's a real professional operation. I don't think he even went into any other room but my bedroom.
Wow.
Like if I had somehow had some jewelry elsewhere. I mean, the luck of it, some of it is, a giant shrug emoji that will spin on indefinitely in space. But some of it is just like actually unbelievable. Like the reason I left the house is because I had hurt my hand and I needed a hand x-ray. And so I took off, because I was going into an x-ray machine or an MRI. I took off all the rings I have worn every day since I was about, 19, because I rarely take them off just to shower and sleep and get robbed.
Wow.
Those are the reasons.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it wasn't ideal, but I was so upset about it in a way that I felt was pathological almost. And then part of the title of the book comes from this sort of corrective that I don't entirely mean, where I was like, well, I'm boring my friends here. Maybe there's some sort of groups for people who have had their houses blow up or have lost everything in a flood or that kind of thing. Because I know that this is bigger than a smashed car windshield. The violation's bigger. Everything about it is bigger. What's missing is much more important. But it's not quite, a tragedy. So I was like, okay. So I went online. Of course, there was nothing. Sorry your house blew up. It was only a house. And then Russell died. And of course, I was inundated. And that's where the title comes from. Grief is for people. Because the silent
as opposed to grief
things.
Is for missing objects.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't entirely mean it, because Russell was so he, part of those weekends when he was so obsessed with the flea market, he was so obsessed with the past. Think about what he did for a living. It's like these reissuing of dead authors, these, he loved old Hollywood, old movies, old music. He collected this china that they only made or this sort of earthenware that they only made in the Midwest in like the 40s. He was one of those people. So yeah.
He hanged himself. He was
Mhm.
discovered by his husband, his
Yes.
partner.
Yeah.
I mean, it's such an obvious question, but I guess it's obvious for a reason.
Mm.
Were there any hints that something like this might happen? I mean, it does seem to come just completely out of nowhere.
Yeah, for him, yeah. Not for a lot of people who experience this, or who know people who have experienced it, I should say. I don't have a camera strapped to my forehead, and even if I did, I wasn't living with him. So I don't know. I'm sort of very careful in the book, as I am now, to only tell about our friendship and speak for what I do know. I felt that he was unhappy. He was unhappy when we had dinner, but it's really hard to measure that happiness against how we all sort of gripe and bitch about life. His home life was not ideal. His work life was not ideal. There are details of why. But, as I say in the book, like, this is somebody who would say, if Fran Lebowitz said, "Oh my God, I'd rather kill myself than go to Times Square," would you put your hand on her shoulder and say, "Should you talk to somebody?" Like, not without full body armor. Don't do that. you know? And so Russell had the same type of quip, if not personality. So he would say stuff like that a lot. But beyond that, no, I didn't know.
Can you read just a little bit from the book?
Sure.
Just a couple paragraphs so we can get a taste.
Sense. Okay. This is actually right after I say that he hangs himself. It's hard to know the size of things, to manage the size of things. Am I making our friendship bigger than it was to keep it from getting any smaller? Making the robbery smaller than it was to keep it from getting any bigger? Am I projecting shared meaning onto completely unassociated events? It's not such a nice world. Bad things happen. Sometimes they happen all at once. Everything is muddled. I feel confused in a medical sense, like a side effect on a bottle. Intellectually, I know that if this must be the story of a felony followed by a suicide, it should have separate entrances, one for the fly and one for the elephant. This is certainly how it will be in the future. Perspective will be painful but effortless. One day there will be only Russell and, on occasion, if I tell the story for long enough, a burglary that happened around the same time. But we are so far from the future. Right now, every time I try to separate these losses to keep the first from contaminating the second, they come back together like magnets. Hideous sisters, they are keeping each other company in the dark. They are in conversation with each other. Sometimes I'm privy to the conversation, sometimes I'm not. They have their own language. The author I admired, the one whose email Russell forged, was Joan Didan. The day I learn he's dead, a detail from the year of magical thinking comes rushing back to me. Shortly after Didian's husband dies, Julia Child dies. Didan expresses relief. She had a sense that this was all finally working out, because now Julia and John could have dinner together. At the time, I found it difficult to believe she actually thought that. Had I been operating in my rational mind, she writes, I would not have been entertaining fantasies that would not have been out of place at an Irish wake. But now I find myself in the throes of a similar fantasy. In this fantasy, Russell is the one who finds the jewelry. Because in this fantasy, there's a lost and found section of heaven where the dead can sift through missing objects and take what they want. This way they have something to love, and those things are loved again. This way they get old, but never age.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That was beautiful. Did this book come really quickly, or was it hard? Joan Didan always talked about how your magical thinking just kind of poured out of her.
Poured out, yeah. I think everything, I'm going to say something gnarly, everything pours out until you get it caught, So yes, it did. I think the difficulty was in sort of corralling it, which sounds obnoxious. If I was talking about straight humor writing, I would never be like, it's just so funny. I have to limit all these many, many hilarious jokes. But for this, I felt it was what belongs in depression, what belongs in bargaining, because there's so many asides and because it's such a sort of formless, mushy, as in the texture, not the emotion, experience, grief is, that, it sort of poured out and then had to be kind of, I would say more like a mercury spill, sort of ushered into certain corners.
Mm-hmm.
But it did. And then I think what became difficult is, going back and realizing, which stories are important to tell, which are maybe chips I have on my shoulder, memories that I have, and which are only about Russell or only about me and Russell. So that's why I don't even almost think of it as a memoir, because I'm like, I think what keeps it off of me slightly, even though the whole thing is obviously from my perspective and a thing that happened to me, I felt like the sort of what saves it, or my sort of stopgap, is the story I'm telling about the two of us and about him. Not just about my experience publishing something, that kind of thing.
How would you characterize the kind of friendship that you had? I mean, it's a classic type of relationship in a way, the gay man and the single woman. We should say you're a single woman, you live in an apartment, you're very glamorous. You have a sort of
like,
Holly Golightly quality. So this is
without the rampant whoring. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah. I just mean, you
I know,
have nice jewelry. And this is a dynamic that gets cartoonified a lot, like in the media. Like we see this kind of exaggerated,
the gay best friend kind of thing.
Gay best friend, right. Fag haggy kind of
totally.
woman, that sort of thing. Obviously, every relationship is different, and your friendship was its own thing. But I wonder if you have thoughts about that kind of friendship dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, you asked how I would categorize it. I mean, I would say it's gone out of fashion in some ways, only because its root system is in work and in a corporate environment. I would say that I don't think we ever even in jest would use those terms. He didn't even like the terms that actually applied to us. So when I would introduce him to people as my boss, he would sort of pull me over and be like, I introduced you to people as my friend. I'm like, you can fire me. So, but no, I think that it was just, he was sort of, I don't want to make him sound like a giving tree, because then that makes me sound like this sort of piece of shit boy who used that tree stump. But he was sort of like a father figure, a brother, a coworker. I did sort of, I think it was hard there was a time period where it was probably hard with different, this is really more for therapy, but relationships with men, because I was getting so much I needed from Russell, but I also spent and I just sort of took for granted I think we both took for granted the fact of each other. We would have lunch together after working, 8-hour days together. He rented an apartment, this tiny little apartment, way up, but like, I think on like, I don't know, it's like 129th or something like that in Amsterdam. Well, from Random House, it's way up, we worked at like Random House is on 50th and Columbus, 58th and Columbus. But we'd walk. He sort of dropped me off at my little tiny apartment on the Upper West Side, and we'd walk home together all the time, and it's just, you become each other's, it's almost like you become each other's default. It's like air, and less of a relationship to define starting from scratch, because it is scratch. That's how it felt.
Did it feel like a surrogate kind of partnership for you? Was he did he always have another partner?
Yeah. Oh,
was
yeah.
He always
same.
with his partner?
Oh, yeah. It's his partner. Yeah. They had been, oh gosh, I don't really know the answer, but I'm going to say I think over 25 years. And so, he always had, but also that his partner sort of became part of our group, I suppose, in the Mary McCarthy way. He was always part of it. It's not like he was the guy who owned the house. He didn't come to the city that much, but we really knew him, and we were all very friendly too. And to skip ahead, he has read the book, and he's okay.
Yeah. That kind of workplace environment that you described, It's so wonderful. And it's so, again,
dangerous.
It's completely obsolete now, right? Like,
yeah.
I mean, the hijinks and the pranks, and I'm not talking about like stupid stuff that you would see on The Office. Like The Office is sort of the Scranton, Pennsylvania version of this. I mean, I remember the first time I worked in an office in New York City. It was like it was a cool kind of arts related enterprise. And
what was it?
I worked at the Film Society of Lincoln Center.
Oh, for some reason I thought you were going to say Open City. I don't know why I felt that.
Oh,
but yes. Okay.
No, this was an office that
an
had
office.
Several people in it, earning salaries. No, I was an intern. I was like 20, and it was a summer during college, and I went into this place, and there were like, I don't know, 20 people there, and they all were different ages, and they had different jobs, but like it was a big open space. So just like the constant carrying on and the talking about things, and the carrying and the joking around, and that we'd be talking about films, and they were screening films for the New York Film Festival, and putting out like Film Comment magazine, and I was just I loved this world, and I was absolutely charmed by the office environment. Like, I thought, this is fantastic.
No, this is living.
Sit there and let it wash over me. Like, listen to these adults have these conversations and kid around, and they would say inappropriate things sometimes, but it was totally fine. It was like in the context, everybody was like on the same page.
I don't know if that's true though,
I think in this case,
it was. Okay,
in this case, it was. Right. Okay. But like there was there was a feeling that this is sophisticated and that this is fun. And I like this way of working.
The thing is, there are a couple of things. One is, I'm glad you gave that example, because you have this baseline sort of merit-based entry of like, are you interested in film? Can you talk about it? Do you want to plug into this? Like, you wouldn't, again, have just sort of fallen backwards necessarily into an organization like that, nor would I
should say the first time I applied for this internship, I did not get it. So I had to apply again the next year. And that was a great lesson too.
Yeah, well, that is it. Yeah,
always apply again.
Always apply again. Don't take it so personally.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have this baseline of like, you're going to have stuff to talk about. It's almost like you're not going to run out of stuff to talk about because you've all plugged into this sort of central system, right? It's all outlets going to the same thing, which is film, art, music, dance, whatever it is. But then also, I think, like you said, it was a real office with real salaries. I imagine a place like that, there are people who are like lifers. And the same thing is true of Knopf and Random House, and those personalities become valued for like, there was an author, there's an editor who will go nameless, or be nameless, who used to use different floors of different bathrooms when she had to go number 2 to like maintain the illusion of like just not having a human system. There was another one who would like basically sneak out the corporate furniture that we had in the middle of the night past security and like sneak in her own sort of like, overstuffed chaises and stuff.
Wait, these were editors? Sorry, not authors. Editors.
These are
editors. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sonny Mehta smoked in his office till like, I don't know, what time is it yesterday? So I think the thing is that you sort of value, but what was confusing, I think, for Russell is that, even more so than me, he grew up in sort of that culture. That's where he came up in it. And I think he confused offense and like quirkiness.
Yes.
Because the truth is all that stuff can now no longer happen. And maybe the smoking should never have happened.
Yeah.
But the stuff about like the weird peccadillos of like where you poop, God love you. That's great. And I just feel like now it's like a matter for human resources.
Yeah. I should say that after this like nirvana of working at the Film Society of Lincoln Center.
Yeah. How long were you? Well, you were an intern.
I was an intern. And then I graduated from college and I got a job at Condé Nast, which was very different. And there were certainly people sneaking around to different bathrooms for different reasons. But
yeah, when you say Condé Nast, the word is not different that comes to mind. It's subservient.
Yeah. So it was definitely unhealthy and downright abusive. Yes, there's a fine line to
My
paraphrase David St. Hubbins from Spinal Tap. There's a fine line between quirky and abusive.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you can't exactly dust for vomit, which is my favorite Spinal Tap line.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, there is a fine line. It's a really, I mean, but what's weird is it's a generational thing, not a corporate thing. I think that's where people get mixed up. Like, I have never felt so powerless and a personal failure to please, or a digested criticism into my root system as I have during my first job, which was essentially like 3 people in an office above like the clock tower in Times Square, the Paramount building, and so that couldn't be less corporate, and it felt much more of a dynamic, a sort of that I was constantly disappointing my boss in a very personal way.
Yeah. Well, we should say, Russell would make jokes that, they read as very funny on the page, but I can imagine that they wouldn't have necessarily gone over with everybody. He says he makes fun of your clothing, and says, and that, you were dressed like a traffic cone one day.
Yes, he did do that. Well, I was, though, to be fair. It was a bright orange A-line dress.
Okay, but it's the kind of thing where I feel like he wouldn't have said it if it were true.
Right. No, I think what bothered his behavior, the story, one of my favorite lines from the book, and honestly, there were so many to choose from, I just sort of picked them out of a hat and threw them in there. But one I can remember him saying quite vividly is, I had an assistant who walked into a small meeting, to be sort of fair, just working on authors' upcoming tour schedules in a tiny little office with like 5 people, including Russell and myself. She walks in wearing this sort of tight cardigan, with like kind of overworked buttons down the middle. And he looks up at her and he goes, "Oh my God, it's like you walked into Talbot's and said, 'Give me the sluttiest thing you have.'" And I was like, "Oh no." And this is way before Me Too or anything. And I sort of pulled her over and I was like, "Yeah, let me know if he says anything that bothers you." Because the thing is, I think we all relied on each other's instincts more. Like, my instinct was to protect this person, to make sure her feelings weren't hurt or that she wasn't uncomfortable, not because it was law, And Russell's instinct was to only say that to people who he thought would find it funny. And he was right with her. Mm-hmm. She found it funny. She said, "I'm fine." He's like, literally, he has no time to actually harm me. He's a busy man. But that wasn't true for everybody. I think he did really hurt a lot of people's feelings.
And was he starting to get into trouble for this kind of thing?
Oh, yeah.
Because times were changing underneath his feet. Do you think that contributed to his distress? Yeah,
part of my, one of your early questions about, or maybe maybe it was just in the format of one of my answers of keeping all stories to either the 2 of us or him. Some of the stuff that got edited out was my insertion of myself into his story. And that includes, like, one quick bit was the first complaint that was filed against him, at least that I know of, I'm 90% sure about this, was about 36 hours after I quit and left the office. And I had been there for 10 years. So I felt like it's hard to think of that panning out, because if I don't know any of the parties, including myself, I don't look so good. It's like I'm the guard dog for an inappropriate person, and I need to be sort of...
That was the first part of my conversation with Sloane Crosley. If you want to hear the rest, which you do, I'm telling you right now you do, it's really good, become a paying subscriber at meghan.substack.com. That will allow you to listen to the entire interview every single week. And this is a great week to start. In the meantime, I will tell you that Sloane's new book is called Grief is for People. It's available now. You should buy it now. She's also the author of the best-selling essay collections, I Was Told There'd Be Cake and How Did You Get This Number? Her novels include Cult Classic and The Clasp. She lives in New York City. I'll be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.